The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle, as Prince William stood at the window of his private study, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders as he gazed out at the perfectly manicured gardens that had been his playground as a child. Today was different from any other day in his life. Today, he would say goodbye to someone who had been the cornerstone of his existence for as long as he could remember. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, entered the room quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the ancient wooden floors. She had learned over the years to read her husband's moods, and today she could feel the heavy sadness that surrounded him like a thick fog. Without saying a word, she moved to stand beside him, her presence offering the comfort that only she could provide. The palace had been bustling with activity since dawn. Staff members moved with purpose through the corridors, their faces reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. Flowers arrived by the hundreds, each arrangement more beautiful than the last. The world was watching, waiting, and preparing to bid farewell to someone who had touched millions of lives across the globe. William turned slightly, his eyes meeting Catherine's. In that moment, no words were needed. They both understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. The cameras, the crowds, the ceremony that would mark the end of an era. But more than that, they understood the personal loss that would forever change their family. The couple had spent the previous evening with their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, trying to explain in simple terms what was happening. How do you tell young minds that someone they love will no longer be there to share bedtime stories or birthday celebrations? Catherine had held Charlotte close as tears streamed down the little girl's face, while William sat with George, his arm around his eldest son's shoulders, both of them struggling with emotions too big for words. As the morning progressed, family members began arriving at the castle. Each face told a story of loss, of memories cherished, and of a future that would look very different. The Queen's other children, her grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered in the grand drawing room, their conversations hushed and reverent. William found himself thinking back to his childhood, to the woman who had been not just his grandmother, but his anchor during the most difficult times of his life. She had been there when his mother died, offering strength when he thought he had none left. She had guided him through his education, his military service, and his transition into royal duties. Most importantly, she had welcomed Catherine into the family with open arms, treating her not as an outsider, but as a beloved daughter. Catherine remembered her own first meeting with the Queen, how nervous she had been, how the monarch's warm smile had instantly put her at ease. Over the years, their relationship had grown into something beautiful and genuine. The Queen had become not just her husband's grandmother, but her own cherished mentor and friend. The palace staff moved with quiet efficiency, making final preparations for what would be one of the most watched events in modern history. Every detail had been planned meticulously, every moment choreographed to honor a life of service and dedication. Yet beneath all the protocol and ceremony lay the simple truth of a family, saying goodbye to someone they loved deeply. As midday approached, William and Catherine knew it was time to join the others. They would need to be strong, not just for themselves, but for their children, for the family, and for a nation that was grieving alongside them. The day ahead would test their composure, their faith, and their ability to find comfort in each other when the world felt like it was shifting beneath their feet. The couple stood together for one last quiet moment in the study, drawing strength from each other's presence. Soon they would step into the public eye, their every emotion scrutinized and analyzed. But right now, in the privacy of their shared silence, they were simply a husband and wife preparing to face one of life's most difficult challenges together. Outside, the world waited. Inside, a family prepared to say goodbye to the woman who had been their guiding light for more than 7 decades. The day that would captivate a nation was about to begin. The car journey from Windsor to London felt both endless and too short at the same time. William sat beside Catherine in the back of the official vehicle, their hands intertwined, fingers providing silent comfort to each other. The streets were lined with people, thousands upon thousands who had traveled from every corner of the country and beyond to pay their respects. Catherine watched through the tinted windows as grown men wiped tears from their eyes, as mothers lifted their children high to catch a glimpse of the procession, as elderly women clutched photographs and flowers. The outpouring of love was overwhelming, a testament to the impact one person could have on so many lives. The Queen's coffin had been lying in state for days, and the queue of mourners had stretched for miles through the heart of London. People had waited for hours, some for entire days, just for the chance to stand before the casket for a few precious moments. The sight of it had moved William to tears more than once. His grandmother would have been amazed by the love shown to her, though she probably would have insisted it was simply people doing their duty. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the magnitude of the occasion became even more apparent. World leaders, heads of state, and dignitaries from every continent had gathered to honor the Queen's memory. The ancient abbey, which had witnessed coronations and celebrations for nearly 1,000 years, now prepared to host a farewell that would echo through history. Catherine squeezed William's hand gently as they caught sight of the abbey's towering spires. She remembered her own wedding day in this very same place, how nervous and excited she had been, how the Queen had smiled at her with such warmth and approval. Now returning under these circumstances felt surreal, like stepping into a dream that teetered on the edge of becoming a nightmare. The couple's children were waiting inside with other family members. George, now old enough to understand the significance of the day, stood straight and tall in his formal attire. Charlotte held tightly to her aunt's hand, her young face serious beyond her years. Louis, the youngest, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, even if he couldn't fully comprehend it. William knelt down to speak with his children before the service began. His voice was gentle but steady as he reminded them of all the wonderful memories they had shared with their great-grandmother. He told them about her love for horses and corgis, about her mischievous sense of humor that few people outside the family ever saw, about her incredible strength and dedication to serving others. Catherine watched her husband with their children and felt her heart swell with pride and sorrow in equal measure. He was being the father he had always dreamed of being, present and supportive even in his own time of grief. She knew his mother would have been proud of the man he had become, of the father he was to his children. The service itself was a masterpiece of dignity and tradition. The hymns that filled the ancient walls were the same ones the Queen had loved throughout her life. The reading spoke of service, of duty, of love that transcends earthly bounds. Every word seemed chosen specifically to honor not just a monarch, but a woman who had devoted her entire life to others. As the ceremony progressed, William found himself thinking about the conversations he had shared with his grandmother over the years. Her advice had always been practical and wise, delivered with a directness that could be startling but was always rooted in love and experience. She had taught him that true leadership meant putting others before yourself. That duty was not a burden, but a privilege. Catherine reflected on the countless family gatherings they had shared, the quiet moments when the Queen would play with the children on the floor of Balmoral, her formal demeanor melting away to reveal the loving great-grandmother underneath. Those private moments, away from the cameras and protocols, had shown her the real woman behind the crown. The music swelled through the abbey as the service reached its crescendo. Every note seemed to carry the weight of history, the gratitude of a nation and the love of a family saying goodbye. The congregation, filled with the most powerful people in the world, sat in respectful silence, united in their admiration for a life well lived. As the final prayers were spoken, William and Catherine prepared for what they knew would be the most challenging part of the day. Soon, they would need to step outside into the bright daylight where millions of eyes would be watching their every expression, their every gesture. The world would be looking to them for strength, for continuity, for hope in the face of profound loss. The moment was approaching when they would no longer be able to hide their grief behind the solemnity of ceremony. Soon they would be face to face with the reality of goodbye, and the entire world would witness their most vulnerable moment. The heavy wooden doors of Westminster Abbey opened, and suddenly the sounds of the world rushed in. The solemn silence of the service was replaced by the distant hum of thousands of voices, the shuffling of feet, and the barely audible clicks of cameras capturing every moment. William stepped forward first, his military training evident in his straight posture and measured steps, but Catherine could see the slight tremor in his hands that betrayed his inner turmoil. The procession began its slow journey through the streets of London. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, was carried with military precision. Behind it walked the family, each step taking them closer to the final goodbye. William found himself focusing on the rhythm of the march, using it as an anchor to keep his emotions steady. Catherine walked beside him, her black dress and hat perfectly appropriate for the occasion. But her eyes told a different story. She watched her husband's profile, seeing the little boy who had lost his mother too young, the young man who had learned to carry the weight of duty with grace, and the father who was now trying to shield his own children from the harsh realities of loss while teaching them about honor and respect. The crowds lining the streets were unlike anything either of them had ever witnessed. People stood 20 deep in some places, many having slept on the sidewalks to secure their spots. Flowers rained down gently from apartment windows above. Union Jack flags waved slowly in the breeze. The silence was extraordinary. For such a massive gathering, broken only by the sound of marching, feet and the occasional sob from someone in the crowd, an elderly woman near the front of the crowd caught Catherine's attention. She was holding a photograph of herself as a young girl, standing next to the Queen during a visit to her hometown decades earlier. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as she pressed the photo to her heart. It was a reminder that this goodbye belonged not just to the royal family but to millions of people whose lives had been touched by one extraordinary woman. William's mind drifted to the countless walkabouts he had done with his grandmother over the years. He remembered how she could light up when meeting people, especially children. She had an uncanny ability to make each person feel like they were the most important individual in the world. During their brief encounter, that gift, he realized, was something he would need to carry forward in his own role. As they turned onto the final stretch leading to Windsor, Catherine noticed a group of children from a local school. They stood in perfect rows, their small hands over their hearts, their faces serious with an understanding that went beyond their years. One little girl, no older than Charlotte, stepped forward and curtsied as the procession passed. The gesture was so pure, so heartfelt, that Catherine felt tears threatening to break through her carefully maintained composure. The children in the crowd reminded both William and Catherine of their own 3 little ones, who were experiencing this loss in their own innocent way. George had asked if Great Granny would be able to see them from heaven, if she would still remember the stories she used to tell him. Charlotte wondered if the Queen's favorite corgis would miss her, if someone would take care of them now. Louis, in his simple way, had asked when she would come back, not quite understanding that some goodbyes last forever. The sun began to set as they approached Windsor Castle, casting everything in a golden light that seemed almost magical. The castle had been the Queen's favorite residence, the place where she had spent her happiest moments with family, away from the constant demands of public life. It seemed fitting that her final journey would end here, in the place she had truly called home. William and Catherine could see Windsor's ancient walls rising before them, and both felt a mixture of relief and fresh sorrow. Relief that the public part of this ordeal was nearly over, but sorrow because it meant they were approaching the moment when they would truly have to let go. The cameras would soon stop rolling, the crowds would disperse, and they would be left with the quiet reality of their loss. The couple's strength had carried them through the day, but as they drew closer to the castle gates, both felt the weight of their grief pressing down more heavily. The formal ceremony had provided structure, a framework for their emotions. Now, as the public farewell neared its end, they would need to find new ways to carry their sorrow and their love. Catherine reached for William's hand as they walked the final steps toward the castle. Her touch was gentle but firm, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had learned over the years that their greatest strength came not from their individual resolve, but from their unity, their ability to support each other through life's most challenging moments. The gates of Windsor Castle came into view, and with them the knowledge that in just a few short hours, they would participate in the most private and painful part of this farewell. The world had witnessed their public grief with dignity and respect. Now came the harder part, learning to say goodbye when no one was watching. The private chapel at Windsor Castle felt smaller than usual as the family gathered for the final service. Gone were the crowds, the cameras, and the watching world. This moment belonged only to them, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had known the Queen not as a monarch, but as the heart of their family. The ancient stones seemed to absorb their collective sorrow, holding it gently within walls that had witnessed centuries of royal joys and griefs. William stood near the front of the chapel, his children close beside him. George held his father's hand tightly while Charlotte leaned against Catherine's side. Louis, overwhelmed by the emotions of the day, had fallen asleep in his mother's arms. The sight of his youngest son's peaceful face provided William with a moment of calm in the storm of his grief. The Queen's coffin rested before them, no longer surrounded by the grandeur of state ceremony, but embraced by the simple, profound love of family. The flowers that adorned it now were personal choices, blooms from her beloved gardens at Balmoral, white roses that reminded everyone of her wedding day, and small posies picked by her great-grandchildren during their last visit together. Catherine found herself remembering the Queen's laughter, a sound that had surprised her the first time she heard it. In public, the monarch had maintained such dignity and composure, but in private moments with family, her joy had been infectious. She had delighted in watching her great-grandchildren play, often joining them on the floor for games that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with being a loving grandmother. The simple service began with a hymn that the Queen had requested specifically for this moment. Her voice seemed to echo in the chapel as family members sang the familiar words, each verse carrying memories of Christmas services and family celebrations when she had led them in the same song. William's voice cracked slightly on the second verse, and Catherine moved closer to him, her presence offering the strength he needed to continue. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, stood at the front of the chapel, his own grief evident in every line of his face. This was his mother, the woman who had guided him through decades of preparation for the role he now held. He spoke briefly about her final weeks, how she had remained concerned about others even as her own strength faded. Her last conversations had been about family, about the children and grandchildren she loved so deeply. William thought about his last private conversation with his grandmother, just weeks before her passing. They had sat together in her sitting room at Balmoral, the summer evening light streaming through windows that overlooked the Scottish Highlands she loved so much. She had spoken about the future, about his role in the family, about the importance of supporting Catherine and raising their children with both privilege and purpose. During that conversation, she had taken his hands in her own, hands that had signed countless documents, worn heavy crowns, and comforted grieving subjects for more than 70 years. Her grip had still been firm, her voice still clear as she told him how proud she was of the man he had become. She had expressed particular appreciation for Catherine, calling her a wonderful addition to the family and praising her natural grace and genuine warmth. Catherine remembered her own final moments with the Queen, a quiet afternoon tea, just the two of them in the garden at Windsor. They had talked about the children, about Charlotte's love of horses and George's growing sense of responsibility. The Queen had shared stories about William and Harry as children, painting pictures of mischievous boys who had brought joy and chaos in equal measure to the palace corridors. As the service continued, each family member was invited to share a memory. The stories painted a picture of a woman who was simultaneously extraordinary and utterly human. She had been a queen who never forgot to send birthday cards to her staff's children, a grandmother who kept a secret stash of chocolate biscuits for unexpected visits from little ones, a great-grandmother who had learned to video call during the pandemic so she could continue reading bedtime stories to children she couldn't visit in person. William spoke about her sense of duty, but also about her sense of humor. He told the gathering about the time she had hidden in a cupboard during a formal tour, just to see how long it would take the staff to find her. He shared how she had taught him to drive in the grounds of Balmoral, laughing as he stalled the car repeatedly and encouraging him to try. Again, with endless patience, Catherine spoke about feeling welcomed into the family from her very first meeting with the Queen. She described how nervous she had been, how the Queen had immediately put her at ease by asking about her family and showing genuine interest in her life before she became part of the royal world. That kindness, Catherine said, had set the tone for every interaction they had shared since. As the final prayers were spoken, the family prepared for the most difficult moment of all. Soon they would watch as the Queen was laid to rest beside Prince Philip, the love of her life who had waited for her for over a year. The finality of it felt overwhelming, even though they had been preparing for this moment for so long. The chapel fell silent except for the soft sounds of quiet weeping. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that something momentous was ending, that their lives would be forever changed by this goodbye. William reached for Catherine's free hand, needing her strength as much as she needed his as they prepared to walk toward the burial site where their beloved grandmother would finally find her rest. The short walk from the chapel to the burial site felt like crossing between two worlds. Behind them lay the formal farewell, the ceremonies and protocols that had marked the end of a remarkable reign. Ahead waited the most intimate moment of all, the final goodbye that would happen away from every camera, every reporter, every watching eye. This last act belonged to family alone, the King George VI Memorial Chapel, where the Queen would be laid to rest beside Prince Philip, was smaller than the grand spaces where the day's earlier ceremonies had taken place. Built into the walls of St. George's Chapel, it felt almost humble despite its royal purpose. The evening light filtered through stained glass windows, casting gentle colors across the stone floor where generations of royals had found their eternal peace. William and Catherine walked hand in hand, their children between them. Charlotte had stopped crying, but her small hand gripped her mother's fingers so tightly that Catherine could feel the little girl's pulse racing. George walked with the careful steps of a boy trying to be brave, his young shoulders carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his age. Louis had awakened but remained quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment even if he couldn't fully understand it. The Queen's coffin, now free from the ornate displays of state ceremony, seemed somehow more personal here. This was where she had always intended to rest, beside the man who had been her constant companion for more than 70 years. Prince Philip's grave lay waiting, and soon they would be reunited in the quiet peace they had both earned after lives dedicated to service. Family members gathered in a small circle around the burial site. The Archbishop's words were simple and beautiful, focusing not on crowns and kingdoms but on love, faith, and the promise of reunion beyond earthly life. His voice carried clearly in the still air, each word chosen to comfort rather than ceremony. Catherine found herself thinking about the legacy the Queen was leaving behind, not just in terms of royal history, but in the very personal lessons she had taught her family, the way she had shown them that true strength came from service to others, how she had demonstrated that duty and love were not opposites but partners, the example she had set of facing difficulties with grace and finding joy in simple moments. William stood with his arm around George's shoulders, feeling the weight of generational responsibility settling on his own. His grandmother had carried the crown with such dignity that it had seemed effortless, but he knew now how much strength and sacrifice had been required. She had given up personal freedom for public service, had put the needs of the nation above her own desires countless times. As the final prayers were spoken, something unexpected happened. A gentle breeze stirred the trees around the chapel, and for a moment the rustling leaves sounded almost like applause. Several family members looked up and small smiles appeared through their tears. It felt like approval, like a blessing, like the Queen herself acknowledging the beauty of the moment. The children had been prepared for this final goodbye, but seeing it happen was different from imagining it. Charlotte stepped forward and placed a small drawing she had made on the coffin, a picture of herself and the Queen having tea together, with lots of bright colors and careful attention to the corgi that always sat nearby. George followed with a letter he had written, his careful handwriting spelling out his love and promise to remember all the stories she had told him. Even Louis, in his innocent way, seemed to understand that this was his moment to say goodbye. He toddled forward and patted the coffin gently, the same way he patted his teddy bear when putting it to bed. The gesture was so pure and sweet that it brought fresh tears to every adult eye watching. William felt a sudden, overwhelming need to be close to Catherine. Throughout their marriage, she had been his anchor in every storm, his source of strength when royal duties felt impossible to bear. Now, facing the loss of his grandmother and the weight of the responsibilities ahead, he needed her more than ever. She seemed to sense his need, moving closer until their shoulders touched. The moment came when they would lower the Queen into her final resting place. The family stood in respectful silence as the ancient ritual played out before them. Each person was lost in their own memories, their own sense of what this remarkable woman had meant to them personally. Catherine remembered the Queen's advice about raising children in the public eye, how to give them normal childhoods while preparing them for extraordinary responsibilities. She thought about the example the Queen had set as a working mother, balancing public duties with private love in ways that had seemed impossible, but had somehow worked. As the ceremony neared its end, William realized that this was not just a goodbye but also a beginning. The Queen's life had been a masterclass in service, duty, and love. Now it fell to him, to Catherine, and to their children to carry those lessons forward. The crown she had worn so gracefully would one day rest on different heads, but the values she had embodied would continue. The final moment approached, and with it, the knowledge that when they walked away from this place, their lives would be forever changed. The Queen's chapter had ended, but the story of the family she had loved and guided would continue. Soon, they would need to face the world as the new generation of royals, carrying her memory and her teachings into an uncertain future. The sun was setting over Windsor Castle, painting the sky in gentle purples and golds. It felt like the perfect backdrop for saying goodbye to a woman who had brought so much light into their lives and into the world. The silence after the final prayer felt different from any quiet William and Catherine had ever experienced. It was complete, profound, and somehow peaceful despite the sadness that filled every heart present. The Queen had been laid to rest beside Prince Philip, their love story finally complete after more than a year of separation. The family stood together in the fading daylight, each person processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. As the Archbishop finished the blessing, family members began to step forward one by one for their personal farewells. This was the moment they had all been dreading and needing in equal measure. The chance to say goodbye without ceremony, without protocol, with only love and gratitude filling the space between them and the grandmother, mother and friend they would miss forever. William approached first, his steps slow and deliberate. He knelt beside the burial site, his head bowed, and spoke quietly words that only he and his grandmother's memory would ever know. His lips moved in what looked like a conversation, as if she were still there to offer her wisdom and comfort. When he finally stood, his face was wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. Catherine watched her husband's private goodbye and felt her own heart breaking for him. She had known that beneath his royal training and public composure lay a little boy who had lost too many important people in his life. His mother's death had shaped him in ways that still showed themselves in quiet moments. Now, losing his grandmother felt like losing his last connection to that earlier, more innocent time. George stepped forward next, and Catherine's heart swelled with pride at her son's courage. At his young age, he was already showing the same strength and dignity that had defined his great-grandmother. He placed his small hand on his heart in a gesture of respect he had learned, then spoke in a voice that was steady despite his obvious emotion. He promised to take care of his brother and sister, to remember all her stories, and to try to be as kind as she had always been. Charlotte's goodbye was perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. The little girl had formed a special bond with her great-grandmother, one built on shared tea parties, horse stories, and whispered secrets. She stepped forward with the careful grace she had been taught, but then broke protocol entirely by blowing a kiss toward the burial site. The spontaneous gesture was so perfectly Charlotte, so full of innocent love, that several family members smiled through their tears. Catherine lifted Louis in her arms as they approached together. The youngest child didn't fully understand what was happening, but he seemed to sense the importance of the moment. He waved his small hand in what looked like a greeting rather than a goodbye, as if he expected his great-grandmother to wave back. His innocent response reminded everyone present that love transcends understanding, that connections of the heart don't require explanations. When Catherine's turn came for her personal farewell, she found herself overwhelmed by gratitude. The Queen had welcomed her into the family with open arms, had mentored her through the challenges of royal life, and had shown her what it meant to serve others with grace and humility. She whispered her thanks for all the lessons learned, all the support given, and all the love shared. As the family began to move away from the burial site, something beautiful and unexpected happened. William, who had been holding his emotions in check throughout the long day, finally let his guard down completely. The weight of loss, the pressure of public scrutiny, and the overwhelming love he felt for his grandmother converged in a moment of pure human feeling. Catherine saw her husband's composure crumble and moved toward him instantly. Without thinking about cameras that weren't there or protocols that no longer mattered, she wrapped her arms around him and held him close. William buried his face against her shoulder and let himself grieve fully for the first time all day. The hug that followed was everything a nation had hoped to see, but had been too respectful to expect. It was real, it was raw, and it was beautiful in its honesty. Catherine held her husband as he sobbed for his grandmother, for his mother, and for all the losses that royal life had demanded he bear with dignity. Her own tears flowed freely as she offered him the comfort that only she could provide. The other family members watched this moment of pure love and connection, with their own emotions running high. Here was the future of the monarchy. Not perfect, not untouchable, but real and human and strong in their love for each other. The sight of William and Catherine supporting each other through their deepest grief reminded everyone that, beneath the titles and duties, lay people who felt lost just as deeply as anyone else. When they finally separated, both William and Catherine looked different somehow. The formal masks they had worn throughout the day were gone, replaced by faces that showed their grief but also their strength. They had supported each other through the most difficult day of their royal lives, and in doing so, had shown the world what real partnership looked like. As they walked back toward the castle with their children, the family seemed to move with a different rhythm. The urgent pace of the ceremonial day had given way to something slower, more reflective. They were no longer racing toward a deadline or fulfilling a schedule. They were simply a family who had said goodbye to someone they loved, and who would now need to learn how to carry on without her guidance. The evening sky over Windsor Castle was painted in soft pastels as the royal family disappeared into the ancient walls that had sheltered their grief and witnessed their love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new ways of honoring the memory of the remarkable woman they had laid to rest. But tonight they would hold each other close and remember that sometimes the most royal thing you can do is simply be human. The hug that had captivated a nation was over, but its meaning would resonate far beyond this single day. It had shown the world that love, support, and genuine human connection remain the most powerful forces of all, even in the face of the greatest losses life can bring.